You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Sleepy Joe, we used to call him, but we didn't know he would actually fall asleep whilst being spoken to in the Oval Office by the Prime Minister of Israel. Now, don't get me wrong, Naftali Bennett would send anybody to sleep, but it's probably wise not to do it in front of the world's cameras. But what about the more profound blunders of Joe Biden in the run-up to and after the atrocity at Kabul airport? Although it turns out that dozens of the Afghans that were killed in that attack were actually shot dead by highly trained US Marines. Just goes to show not to believe the first thing you're told on the mainstream media, who said there were 2 bombs and it was a series of complex attacks, when it was the most primitive kind of attack and there was only one of them. It's not just Afghanistan this week. There's a whole lot going on. This is indeed the mother of all talk shows. It's the Open University of the Airwaves. So, you've paid your tuition fee, which was precisely nothing, so fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy ride. It's the mother of all talk shows.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. George Galloway.
This is Radio Sputnik.
And this is London. If you're listening in the Washington, D.C. area, you're listening on Crystal Clear FM 105.5. Why don't you tune in if you're in D.C.? And we're on AM right across the United States, from Burning City to Burning City. Although it's funny, none of these cities seem now any longer to be burning. You can listen across the entire globe thanks to SputnikNews.com. But if you are one of the more than 500,000 people that every week watch as well as listen, then please listen up. If you are watching on Facebook, whether my Facebook or RT's multiple Facebook portals, please share right now with all of your friends so that Mr. Algorithm can no longer suppress us. Tell all your friends now that I'm broadcasting live on RT, on the mother of all talk shows. I'd thank you if you were to do so. And if you're watching on YouTube, either again my own YouTube page or RT's multiple YouTube pages, please subscribe while you're there. You can watch on Twitter on your telephone. You can watch on Instagram. My good wife is here. That's why we're on Instagram. You can watch on Twitch. You can watch on a multitude of different platforms. But however you watch or listen, the one thing you'll get here is the truth. At least the truth as I see it. I might be wrong, but you can be sure that I believe that I am right, that nobody paid me to have the views I have, that no one can buy me or rent me, that no one can frighten me out of the views that I have. Let me say right up at the top, I'm dedicating this show to the late and great Brian Travers, one of the dearest of my friends that I ever had or ever will have. Brian Travers, the saxophone player, songwriter, musician, painter, and human being of the very highest order. That's Brian there It's one of my proudest possessions, that picture, because the relationship that I had with Brian Travers was such that I broke down and cried when I learned that he had passed away after a brave fight with cancer. And I mean brave. You'd have had to know how he fought that cancer to know what bravery is. Brian Travers was part of UB40 from the beginning, a founder, member of the band, the writer of some of their best tunes, the saxophonist on all of their best tunes, and a man who knew the music business inside out, who could have sat on his laurels as a great sax player. But he was always reaching, stretching into different areas. He developed himself as a quite outstanding painter, and I'm very glad to say that I am in possession of some of his work that I can enjoy and treasure for always. The band split up, but they have come together in their mutual grief and respect at the passing of Brian Travers. He was also a founder member of the party that I lead, the Workers' Party of Britain, joined on day one. He was a socialist. He was a working class man. He was a working class hero. And as John Lennon told us, a working class hero is something to be. May God rest your sweet soul, Brian Travers. Like me also, Brian is of Irish extraction, and therefore was very familiar with the British state's crimes in Ireland, one of which we'll be talking about in the show this evening. In the 1980s, I was closely associated with the magazine Private Eye. I used to write for them. I used to come and go in their office in Soho in London. I used to attend the famous Private Eye lunches in the Coach and Horses in Soho. And one man's name was very often on the lips of the people who made Private Eye great during that period. And that name was Colin Wallace. Colin Wallace was a British state intelligence asset who was used here in Britain and in Ireland for some of the most nefarious, dirty tricks in a long, dirty war conducted by our own intelligence services against not only the people of Ireland, but also against the Labour Party and its leaders, Harold Wilson and Ted Short, in government in the 1970s here in Britain. Just like Dr. David Kelly, about whom more later, Colin Wallace started to go rogue. He started to question the role of Britain in Ireland and the role that he, in particular, was being asked to play against democracy in Britain, which he'd always thought was what he was fighting for in Ireland on behalf of British state security. And lo and behold, he got set up and charged with murder. I suppose he was lucky in the way that Dr. David Kelly was not. A fascinating new film about Colin Wallace and his life and times has been produced, and we are lucky enough to be interviewing the man who made the film later in this show. But I expect the show this week will, as last week, be dominated by the extraordinary events in Afghanistan. An horrific, obscene terrorist atrocity was carried out at Kabul airport, as, with unerring accuracy, the American government promised us it would be. They even identified the name of the organization, hitherto unknown to most people, that would carry it out. They even knew that it was going to be an explosion, and explosion it was. The organization that carried out the attack on Kabul airport was something called ISIS Khorasan. Khorasan has been used before as a reason for a massive increase in the offensive military power used in Syria by the coalition of the killing there. Khorasan is a real place. Khorasan is Afghanistan and Pakistan and part of former Soviet Central Asia. And it is perfectly possible that there is such an organization as ISIS Khorasan. Although how that would be differentiated from ISIS, which of course we've been doing our best to help in Syria over this last decade, would be more difficult in the time available to me to adumbrate. But in any event, amongst the thousands, tens of thousands of Afghan civilians massing at the airport, as the United States government asked them to do, come to the airport, they told everyone who thought they had a right to be flown out by these scuttling occupation forces, and they duly did. And they were standing knee-deep in sewage, waving their papers pathetically, trying to attract the attention of those with the power to let them on board an aeroplane and out of harm's way, they thought. But they were not out of harm's way. Joe Biden, Sleepy Joe, we called him, that's actually before he actually fell asleep whilst listening to, there he is there, literally asleep, while the Prime Minister of Israel is talking to him in the United States. I was glad when he woke up. I thought perhaps he'd passed away, died of boredom, listening to Naftali Bennett, the new Prime Minister of Israel. But Joe Biden, on the night of the horrific attack, which killed perhaps 200 people, 200 people, and maimed and injured hundreds and hundreds more, told the American people 8 hours after the event, 8 hours after the event, that America had faced a series of complex attacks, only for the Pentagon spokesman to confess the next day that it was not complex, it could not have been more primitive, that it was not attacks, it was one attack. The two explosions was only one explosion. The attackers were only one terrorist, fanatic suicide bomber with explosives strapped to his chest had somehow managed to kill such a vast number of people. Call me old, but I smelt a rat at the number of people dead from one suicide bomber. And I was right to smell that rat, because it turns out that most of the people killed at Kabul airport were not killed by the ISIS suicide bomber, but were killed by reckless automatic fire from the United States Marine Corps. It reminded me of my grandfather's famous story, so famous he told it every time he had a drink, that when he was at Monte Cassino in World War II in Italy, when the Germans flew over, all the British ducked. And when the British flew over, all the Germans ducked. And when the Americans flew over, everybody, Germans and British, ducked. this kind of reckless display of lethal violence killed most of the 200, most of them. Imagine it. They were there with their papers trying to reach America, and they were shot down by American armed forces. Tells you much, I think, about the reckless disregard, or perhaps the contempt, which the occupation had come to feel for the people of Afghanistan. Somehow summed up, although I know it's complicated, by the extraordinary decision to put a lot of pet animals on an airplane with no people on board, when thousands of people were still waiting to be airlifted to safety away from the Taliban. A lot of Taliban fighters were killed in the airport incident also, though whether they were blown up or shot by the Marines remains a mystery. But Joe Biden's 8-hour delay, his utterly misleading, if not deliberately false report, haltingly delivered, seemingly by a man with 1 foot at least in the grave, 1 foot at least in the grave, was nothing as to what he did next. He's just droned an entire family in Kabul. A man, a wife, children, grandchildren have all just been slaughtered today by a drone attack launched by Joe Biden. He says it was an attack on ISIS Khorasan masterminds, balderdash. It was the mass murder of yet another Afghan family, untold thousands of whom have already been wiped out by such insane, indiscriminate use of lethal firepower. The muscles, but not the brains. That's the United States Armed Forces. And that's why they, and therefore we here in Britain and other allies of the United States, are in the place we now are, utterly humiliated by an American president that knew for 18 months that his predecessor had signed a deal to leave, but did nothing to prepare the thousands, tens of thousands of British and American people to get them out of the country before the Taliban took power. It beggars belief. It is beyond belief that you would scuttle out of a country in the middle of the night, leaving billions of dollars of high-powered weaponry, even Black Hawk helicopters. You didn't even blow them up. They left them there. And they're now in the hands of the Taliban if we're lucky, of ISIS if we're unlucky. Just ponder that. In the middle of the night, without even telling the Afghan army serving on the same base that you were leaving and you wouldn't be coming back. Whilst knowing that tens of thousands of your own nationals were now unprotected from a Taliban onslaught and ultimate victory. There's still 1,500 British citizens in Afghanistan who have not been able to be airlifted, although those pets were. And the reason for that is because Joe Biden left us all up the creek without a paddle. I don't know how the citizens of the United States can bear to be led by such an imbecile who can't even stay awake whilst talking to another prime minister in full view of the television and still cameras. I've gone on too long. There's so much I want to say. I said much of it last week, and I've tried again this week. If you're not careful, if we're not all careful and lucky, I'll have to be talking about it for many, many weeks to come. But you've come to the right place to have a proper up and down, bare knuckle Barney about this. If you disagree with me, we want to hear from you on the telephone, on the Twitter, on the email. Thank you very much for listening to that monologue. Here's the first of our break questions. On this day in 1842, Britain and China signed the Treaty of Nanking. What did it do? A, end the Opium War. B, legalize opium production. C, allow Christian missionaries. Answer after the break.
Radio Sputnik.
Time, weather, and highways.
Now, don't forget, you can download the podcast of this program, a finely edited highlights version of this 3-hour epic. It's being listened to now all around the world. Huge numbers are downloading the, as it were, compact version of the show. Of course, in the UK and the US, but listen to these countries that downloaded it last week: Japan, India, Denmark, Saudi Arabia, Korea, Switzerland, UAE, and Hong Kong in China. All of those had significant audiences of last week's show. Search Moats, M-O-A-T-S, on the app where you get your podcast from.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
On this day in 1842, Britain and China signed the Treaty of Nanking, which A, ended the Opium War. A poll is flying out the traps. Was it right to fly out 168 dogs and cats from Afghanistan rather than people? A, yes. B, no. You can vote on my Twitter feed, on YouTube, and on Telegram. And don't forget, by the way, to download our podcast, which is literally breaking all records. Some social media, Lachlan McNeil says, firstly, to my knowledge, it was a private chartered flight and not a government flight. And secondly, all the pets were in the hold until the first drop of people en route to the UK. Then some animals were moved into the cabin. On a private chartered flight, it's no one's business. Well, up to a point, Lachlan. First of all, there were no people on board. They were unable to be loaded in time, didn't have the proper papers, and that's why the animals were moved into the cabin. Private chartered flight, I'm not sure that makes all that much difference. James Parker says, why do US, the UK, have to keep paying the cost for a US foreign policy that looks no further than the next arms deal? And Durfan says, I don't know the answer to your poll, but this action definitely defines the value of Afghan people in the eyes of the Americans. The choice was dogs or Afghans. Smiling face with tear. Much more where that came from. I fear we've alienated the animal lovers. I did tell the editor, Ron Mackay, whose poll question this is, that in the past, whenever I've called for the muzzling of dogs, etc., the switchboard has lit up. They say never perform with children or animals. Never tangle with animals in a Twitter poll was my advice to the editor, who completely ignored me. Now, Major Stephen Harley served 3 tours in Afghanistan in the British Armed Forces and is now a security expert and analyst based in Africa. And I'm glad to say he joins us now. Major Harley, thank you for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Let me start with the startling revelation that most of the people who perished in the horrific, obscene ISIS terror attack at Kabul airport were not killed by ISIS, but by American troops. Did that come as a shock or a surprise or both?
Well, good evening, George. It's good to speak to you again. I'm going to be cautious in my response to this because having worked in this space for a long time, having been in the military in Iraq, been in Afghanistan, as you say, now working in various places in Africa, I want to know more about this. I want more detail. But if this is the case, then, well, first of all, in the aftermath of the suicide attack, it's not a pleasant experience. It's not something that is under control for a very, very long time. Now, I'm sorry if I'm sounding like a government spokesman when I say this.
I don't know about anyone else, but I can barely hear Stephen. We'll come back to you, Stephen, because of course it's very important to hear what you've got to say. That's why it's better if we get a clearer line. Now, Ahmed Ruba says the dogs and cats were under threat from the Taliban's dogs and cats. Barry John Davis says it was never rather than. I'm disappointed in you this time, George. And Italo Scott says it was in addition to people, not instead of. It's the British way. It demonstrates our humanity, elevates us above the level of the barbaric, brutal head choppers of the Taliban, demonstrating that all life is sacred. Well, again, up to a point. I'm second to no one in my detestation of people's heads being cut off. But the children and the women that were massacred in their home in Kabul today by an American drone almost certainly lost their heads also. Almost certainly had their heads severed from their shoulders. You see, it's not only a beheading when it's with a knife. It's a beheading when it's with a cruise missile too. It's a beheading when it's with a drone too. It's a beheading when it's with a B-52 or an F-16. They're all beheadings. So let's not have double standards about beheadings, shall we? Eve is in Idaho. Let's hear from him. Eve, welcome back.
George, thank you for this beautiful monologue. You know, I was not aware of what you said about the fact that a lot of the casualty was done by the Marines. Most of the casualties. This is terrible. No, I wanted to talk about the visit of Naftali Bennett. You see, my point, you can imagine that if you want the ear of the President of the United States, this is not the best time. And the fact that he came was because he has something very important to tell. And I think he told it pretty clearly, and nobody picked it up. He said, after the introduction, he said, he said, Israel is responsible for their own security. I understood it as we are going to attack Iran. In fact, before that, he said the main issue is Iran, and right after, he said that they are responsible of their security. And what he told the American is that they are going to attack Iran. That's their plan B, because the plan A didn't work. And after, they expect us to clear the mess. That is what I understood. Now, that's my first point. My second point, and that is that, and it will lead to a question, is that the Iranians are enriching. And I wonder if I were an Iranian, if it's a wise thing to do. Because either you don't enrich or you make a bomb, but you don't stay in this gray area where you have enriched uranium, but it's not going to help you, and it's going to provoke a war against Israel. So that was my that's what I wanted to say.
Well, you've said it very well. I have said many times, and I'll say it again, that if I were Iran, I would develop a nuclear weapon. I see no reason why Israel should be allowed to have hundreds of nuclear weapons and Iran not allowed to have one. I see no reason why Britain and France and India and Pakistan should be allowed to have nuclear weapons, but Iran should not. But Iran is very clear that it does not have and has no intention of developing a nuclear bomb because of theological objection to it, to a weapon of mass destruction, unlimited in time and space. They've been very clear about that. Indeed, Khomeini himself issued a fatwa on that. You say that Iran is enriching, and it is, but entirely within the law, a law which it adheres to, but Israel does not. Iran is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It is in absolute compliance with the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which polices these matters. It has now enriched beyond the terms of the Iran nuclear deal, because there is no Iran nuclear deal once the United States scrapped it. But it is within the limits of enriched fuel enshrined in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So the reality is the Iranians will take this enrichment up to the wire, but they will unlikely, unless they take my advice, they are unlikely to cross the wire. As to whether or not that gives a pretext for Israel to attack them, Israel has no need of a pretext to attack them. Israel is already attacking them, murdering their scientists, their academics, and so on. If Israel wants to attack Iran, it will be in no need of a pretext for doing so. But I've got to tell you, and you know already that we disagree on this, I don't believe that Israel will attack Iran, because Israel knows that Iran can attack it back. And not just attack it back from Iran, but from Iraq, from Yemen, from Syria, from Lebanon, from the Gaza Strip, all at the same time. And Israel's new friends in the Gulf, about whose friendship they made such a song and dance, would instantly be aflame if Israel were to attack Iran. Saudi Arabia would be on fire. Yes, on fire. The United Arab Emirates might cease to exist. Bahrain might cease to exist if Israel were to attack Iran. So I believe that Bennett went to the White House to show the Israeli people that he's now in charge. It's him that's boring a US president half to death, and him that actually achieved the hitherto impossible of sending an American president fast asleep. Now, Stephen Harley is back. Stephen, I hope this line is better. Thank you for staying on the line. I was asking you if you were surprised or shocked at the fact that the majority of the dead people outside Kabul airport were not killed by ISIS, but by American Marines.
Thanks, George. Thanks for bearing with me while I try to resolve my communications problems here in Africa. Well, George, I'm going to give you a bit of a government spokesman answer on this one, I'm afraid, and I know you won't like that. But having been in this space for a long time, having been in Iraq with the military, having been in Afghanistan in a variety of roles, now doing various things in Africa, I'll want to know the facts before I start drawing my conclusions. That said, in the aftermath of a suicide attack, and I've been close to one, it's virtually impossible to know what happened. Anything is possible. So, as I say, I'm giving you a government spokesman answer, but I want to know more. And if it did happen the way you're describing it, again, there's got to be an investigation after this. There's got to be a massive investigation after all of this. So we find out why all of this has happened.
The second explosion at the Baron Hotel, one very familiar to British military and diplomatic and intelligence personnel, never happened. There was no second explosion. There was only one suicide bomber. It was as primitive an attack as it's possible to imagine. How do you think the assassin managed to do it?
Well, I've actually done a lot of work on the subject of suicide attacks, George. And there is I think we have to remember that what's the biggest killer of men under 40 in Western Europe? It's suicide. So in many ways, the whole issue of suicide, it can be weaponized for terrorism, but it's actually a deeper psychological state, and there's a number of components that contribute. I mean, it's not just one single thing that turns someone into a suicide attacker. Why do people do it in the circumstances of what we call the Islamist terror groups, which I hate the name because it's an insult to Islam? Why are suicide attackers so common there? Well, again, a lot of it's to do with the circumstances. People who have been possibly worn down through family circumstances, through the general country system, where it's unfair and corrupt, doesn't give them a fair chance. When you get nothing to live for, then when someone gives you something to die for, that can often seem a better option. And a lot of times these people are vulnerable or have been made vulnerable. This is why whenever I hear about a female suicide attacker, we've all just got to stop. Because I know certainly Al-Qaeda in Iraq is appalling things to women to get them into the mindset of being willing to commit suicide attacks, because anything was better than what we were living through.
Now, Major, I told Jack Straw in January of 2002, when he had the gall to say that the British soldiers might well be home for Christmas. Foolish man. I told them that we will not be home 10 Christmases hence. As usual, I understated my case. It turned out to be almost 20 Christmases later. Now that it's all over, and the last of your fellow servicemen and women are back home. How would you summarize our latest, of course it's not our first, even our second, or even our third invasion of Afghanistan? How do you summarize it now?
It's a very, very difficult one to summarise right now, George, particularly for military veterans. And military veterans were in a difficult position anyway. Many of them are really struggling with what they have gone through. And the events of the last couple of weeks have made it seem like everything they went through, losing friends, losing limbs, losing eyesight, and not just their own people, but seeing other people, the Afghans we befriended, having these same similar injuries inflicted upon them without the aftercare. It's a terrible, terrible blow. How do you summarise it? Well, in the short term, I'm coming from the point of view of having been an officer in the army. We've got to look after people. And what can we do right now? Well, we can't do much for the Afghans given the circumstances, but we can do something for our soldiers. We can try to rationalise this mess. We can try and emphasise that there are some positives. But right now, George, we need an electron microscope to find the positives. And a lot of it's just going to be at the, band of brothers, low level, bonding, little victories that were achieved.
Stephen, I'm extremely sorry. I'm going to have to knock it on the head because the line is just too bad. I hope we can get back to you, but if not, another time. Now, in this week, in 1968, the first record on the Apple label came out. What was it? A, Trash, Road to Nowhere. B, Beatles, Hey Jude. C, John Lennon, Imagine. Answer after the break.
Radio Sputnik.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones? With the historical context to tie them together, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host, Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Talk shows. Join our faculty of legends, contributors, and callers. Everyone is welcome.
It was, of course, the Beatles' Hey Jude that this week in 1968 issued the very first record on the Apple label. Sorry about Major Harley's line. He is in Africa, but we hoped that the quality of the line would be better. Now, we intended that Major Harley gave us the British perspective, and later the one and only Chris Hedges will give us the American perspective. But just like last week, we are determined to get a range of voices from the Afghan perspective. Now, Obaidullah Baheer is a very interesting man, so interesting he's able to get articles into The Guardian, even though his grandfather was one of the founders of the Mujahideen. Hekmatyar was his grandfather. His father is still a very important person, pro-Taliban voice inside Afghanistan. But Obaidullah Baheer has a different perspective. But he's determined to stay in his country. He hasn't given up on Afghanistan yet. and he joins us now on the mother of all talk shows. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us. You wrote in The Guardian that whilst your father had welcomed the glorious victory of the Taliban, that you yourself were not so sure. I wonder if you're any more or less sure now this evening as you were when you wrote the piece. How's it looking from your standpoint?
Thank you, Mr. Galloway, for having me on your show. A big fan. I'm going to try to do better than the African connection that you had earlier, but it's Afghanistan, so nothing is very predictable. Look, I reckon that if you contrast it with what was going through our heads a day or two before the fall or during the fall, compared to where we are right now, if nothing else, at least the killing has stopped to a major extent. The scale of fighting that was happening throughout Afghanistan, that has stopped. Our major fear was that they were going to start bombing Kabul. They were going to try and take Kabul by force, which would necessarily be a repeat of the 90s. And that wasn't a world we were prepared for because our families were here. That being said, there are obviously downsides to it as well. And you waver with regards to your motivation and your conviction to your cause, because you wake up high-spirited and then you hear things, you see things that break your spirit. But we're trying. I mean, like even with universities today, the Taliban formed their higher education commission. They had their minister appointed as well yesterday. And they said that they're going to let women get educated, but classes are going to be segregated and there will only be female faculty teaching the female students. We don't have female faculty. The one Afghan private university that I lecture at does not have a single female faculty in our department. So I don't know how that model is going to work. So we're going to try and reach out to them and convince them that if it's really the physical presence of a male teacher that is the problem, we could teach them online as well. And there has to be a way around it, because this is like saying no. They might just as well tell them to sit at home if they're not going to have faculty teaching them.
Ontology is important, isn't it? So let's try and define the Taliban. There is a qualitative difference, is there not, between a national resistance movement, albeit one motivated by Islam, like the Taliban, and the pan-Islamist with ambitions to fly their black flag all over the world, from Buckingham Palace to Pennsylvania Avenue included. So the Taliban and ISIS and Al-Qaeda are not the same thing, are they?
No, they aren't. Actually, there's a lot of literature as well that segregates and divides, categorizes these people. With regards to jihadi Salafist groups as well, there are jihadi Salafist groups that really care for near enemies, others care for far enemies. With regards to an emirate, an emirate by definition is an Islamic state within one country, and it limits itself to that border. But once you declare a caliphate, which is what the Islamic State did, you're basically all over the world, and everyone has to come and give you a pledge of allegiance. So that basically negates the movements of Al-Qaeda, negates the movements of the Taliban. With regards to the Taliban and Al-Qaeda as well, there is a very long history there. There are familial ties there. Obviously, the Taliban, if they act rationally, there is an incentive to limit the movements and activity of Al-Qaeda within Afghanistan. But it's really scary as well as interesting to see how the Taliban would use their own expertise in battle and the same sort of headache they were giving the regime as to how they would handle another element that is the ISIS movement, and how they would deal with them. Again, the asymmetry of capabilities is very off here. With regards to the Taliban were very strong, very well equipped compared to the Republic. As well, ISIS isn't really that big in Afghanistan, or ISK, to be more precise, isn't really that strong, that deeply rooted within Afghanistan. It has a lot of foreign fighters. It's just the fear was that if the Taliban had negotiated a a more political settlement, the Taliban fighters that would have thought that their cause was betrayed, they would have turned to ISIS. Then ISIS or ISK would have been a much bigger problem. So right now it's something controllable. It's just that there was a huge security vacuum, and it was a collective failure on everyone's parts as to what happened at the airport. So we'll have to wait and see as to whether the Taliban really take their governance role seriously, whether they can administer this country, because right now they have armed people with turban pushing people around in the city, and that's not how policing is done, not through battle-hardened fighters. You don't really expect them to understand how the protocols or procedures of policing work. They've called back the traffic police, which is a good sign, and I hope they can call back or reestablish the police institution within Afghanistan.
Now, the talk was in the first couple of days that quite well-known international figures like the former President Hamid Karzai, the Foreign Minister Oswald, Abdullah, that they would, as it were, provide the lipstick on the new Taliban power in Kabul. Where do we stand with all that now?
Well, my grandfather was part of that coordination committee that was formed. It was very ad hoc. It was done last minute when Kabul fell. And the concept was that they knew that the Taliban really needed a more formal transfer of power if they had any hope of gaining international legitimacy, which was one reason the Taliban didn't want to enter Kabul, because if they took Kabul by force, they lost that chance of legitimacy, the warning that was given to them by Troika +1 multiple times. But when they realized there was a security vacuum, that the police had disintegrated. If the dogs are bothering you too much, I can close the window.
Not at all, no.
Okay.
As long as they're not the dogs of war.
Yeah, no, as in they don't have anything better to do at night, so they just go crazy at each other. So with regards to that, there was this need, and the Taliban didn't want to march into Kabul, but once the security vacuum had been created and the military disintegrated after the president fled, you had a lot of people looting houses and taking people's cars and guns, and so that lawlessness forced the Taliban to march in. With regards to what that committee has done so far, the Taliban have been using that as a front to say that they're taking time to create a more inclusive setup. The idea is that the takeover of Afghanistan, the blitz happened so quick that it was a surprise to the Taliban as well. So the Taliban really don't have a plan. At least they didn't have it when Kabul fell to them, which meant that they had to really rush their homework and try to come up with something. We hear that Mullah Akhundzada, the emir of the Taliban movement, is apparently in Kandahar now. Mullah brother has gone there as well. They're having consultation. With regards to what the political system would look like, I guess, just like you said, there would be some facade of inclusivity. But at the end of the day, they don't have any reason to share power because they came to power through a total victory. And you don't really see many groups sharing power from such a position of strength.
Except it would be quite important, and from my point of view, as long as the Taliban are not allowing Afghanistan to become again a base for the other kind of Islamists that we talked about earlier, the pan-Islamic jihadists who wish to spread their ideology everywhere and are prepared to use violence to do so. As long as the Taliban does not permit Afghanistan to become again a haven for such people, there's no reason in principle, I stress in principle, why international recognition and trade and aid and so on cannot be concluded with the government in Kabul. And for that to happen, obviously the presence of Karzai and people like him would be valuable to them. So what would be in it for Karzai, Abdullah? What would be in it for them to be a facade for the Taliban?
Look, there isn't much to gain, Mr. Galloway. At this point, the war is lost. The Taliban have won a total victory. So anything that comes their way is better than nothing. In a situation where there was actually talk in an article on New York Times, I think, that said that the Taliban had disarmed the guards of Hamid Karzai, and he was living now in Abdullah's house. So they have that, they can go to those extremes. With regards to international recognition and legitimacy, it's a very difficult balancing act, because the moment they strip the Taliban of any legitimacy, there are a few things that happen. A, the brunt of it is suffered by the common poor Afghan man, the economy, and so on and so forth. The other is you push the Taliban towards different patrons, so they will turn towards China, towards Russia, and then you lose all control. On the other end, giving legitimacy too easy would be problematic as well, because that undermines our cause, where we are trying to negotiate a social life, a social structure, a society within Afghanistan that can be sustainable. And if the international community really doesn't condition its legitimacy on anything, it becomes very problematic for us to raise our voices, because we would need these people's continuing legitimacy. So again, legitimacy isn't like it can be given once and that's it. It can be revoked. Sanctions can be reinstated. All of those are options and leverages that the international community, the United States and its allies have. And they really have to use it. So with regards to inclusivity, I guess it's just that these people want to stay here, especially with regards to Karzai and Abdullah, and they do realize that the inclusivity will demand that they will have some semblance of power. But at the core of it, we are looking towards an autocracy. It is the emirate, just with a different name and a different brand. And that's our sad reality. Like we could moan about it, we could cry over it, but this is it. It's happened. Now it's about how we deal with it, which is where me staying here starts. Because if I turn my back, like a lot of people who had genuine security reasons to leave the country, it'll just create an echo chamber, and we don't want the Taliban staying in an echo chamber, because if they keep doing what they're doing, they will end up being pariahs. They will end up becoming a fragile state, and fragile states are breeding grounds for insurgencies and pan-Islamist groups, like you said.
Will your bloodline protect you from harm? We must hope so. I noted you wrote about the traffic cop who pulled you over and then asked God to bless you. Was that because of whose grandson you are? I mean, will you be safe to stay? Will you be able to speak, to write?
Well, obviously, my stance doesn't fall in line with what my family stands for. But that being said, I am afforded a certain level of safety net because of whose family I belong to, and maybe the Taliban wouldn't rush into being on the bad books of that family. But no, most of my interactions with the Taliban have been as a common Afghan. I just wear my suit and tie, and when I come out of a meeting, the Taliban have stopped me, and they're pleasantly surprised when I meet them. Culturally, I understand the nuance of the culture. I've grown up in a political family. That's basically the ABCs that you're taught. So it's shocking to them, and it's a pleasant surprise to me as well, because these people are well behaved.
Well, I'll tell you what. Let's hope, Doctor, that the surprises continue to be pleasant, and I hope you'll stay in touch with the show. It's been most interesting talking to you.
Thank you for having me, Mr. Galloway.
Radio Sputnik News.
A US drone has reportedly hit multiple suicide bombers on the way to Kabul airport. It follows an earlier US airstrike in the capital. US officials told the AP news agency that the drone struck a vehicle containing multiple suicide bombers on their way to the airport. It's understood that the threat was eliminated, they said. Footage shared on Twitter appears to show the aftermath of the explosion that occurred earlier near the capital city airport. The video was posted by a freelance journalist. Around 1,000 civilians remained at Kabul airport today to be flown out of Afghanistan before the last US troops withdraw on Tuesday. The British ambassador to Afghanistan has arrived in the UK, with the last of the British soldiers to leave Kabul expected to touch down within hours. The final flight left on Saturday, bringing an end to the UK's 20-year military involvement in Afghanistan. Ambassador Sir Laurie Bristow, who had been processing those fleeing the country at the airport, was among those who landed at RAF Bryce Norton base in Oxfordshire on Sunday morning. The flight came via the United Arab Emirates, and further flights carrying military and civilian personnel are expected later. More than 15,000 people have been evacuated by the UK since August 14th. The number of new COVID cases reported in Scotland has hit another high record of 7,113. It comes as Health Secretary Humza Yousaf warned that the NHS was facing a perfect storm of pressure. The latest government figures show a total of 507 people are in hospital with COVID and 52 are in intensive care. People under 40 are being urged to get the COVID jab to help ease the increasing strain on the NHS. Around 2/3 of cases are in the under 40s group. GPs are having to make difficult choices about which patients to get blood tests because of the ongoing shortage of test tubes, doctors are warning. Vials used for blood tests are currently in short supply, and the NHS in England and Wales is temporarily stopping all non-urgent testing. Doctors say they are in a perilous situation and want more clarity about how long the shortage will last. The government says it's working flat out with the supplier. Becton Dixon, the company which supplies the NHS, said it had seen record demand for its blood collection tubes in recent months, partly driven by the need for tests for COVID patients. It also said it was facing issues transporting the tubes, for example, challenges at the UK border because of the shortage. The NHS in England and Wales has told surgeries and hospitals to temporarily stop some blood testing, with patients told they will only be able to get tests if they are urgent. Tens of thousands of people are fleeing the US state of Louisiana as Hurricane Ida closes in from the Gulf of Mexico. Ida is now a Category 4 hurricane, one below the highest level, with up to 150 mile-per-hour sustained winds. It's expected to make landfall later today, bringing a life-threatening storm surge. It's likely to be stronger than Hurricane Katrina, which devastated much of New Orleans in 2005. Traffic jams clogged motorways as residents heeded orders to evacuate. The current 150 mile-per-hour maximum sustained wind speed is only 6 miles per hour short. No Category 5 has ever hit Louisiana. A Brazilian woman has been sentenced to 31 years in prison for planning the murder of her husband, the former Greek ambassador to Brazil. In 2016, 59-year-old Kyriakos Amaridis' charred remains were found in the boot of a burned-out car in Rio de Janeiro. His wife, Francois de Souza Oliveira, had been having an affair with a military police officer, Sergio Gomez. Gomez later confessed to killing the ambassador at the behest of his lover and has been jailed for 22 years. At the end of their 3-day trial, a judge described their crime as bestial. A Californian parole board has voted to grant prison release to the murderer of Democratic 1968 president candidate Robert F. Kennedy. Sirhan Sirhan served 53 years in jail for shooting the frontrunner after a speech in Los Angeles hotel, arguably altering the course of history. The vote establishing that he is not a public threat does not necessarily guarantee that he will walk free. The decision now falls to the Democrat governor of California, Gavin Newsom, who is currently in the throes of an election campaign. Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro says he sees three possibilities for his future: re-election in 2022, death, or imprisonment. According to most opinion polls, the far-right leader is trailing behind former left-wing President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva in the race for presidency. Bolsonaro later added that the first opinion is out of the question. No man on earth will threaten me, he said. The former military officer was nearly killed after being stabbed in the abdomen during the 2018 presidential campaign. Apple chief executive Tim Cook has celebrated 10 years on the job by collecting and selling off $750 million worth of stock. The transactions were revealed in a regulatory filing on Thursday, which showed that Cook had acquired and sold more than 5 million shares of the iPhone maker. And finally, a self-driving Toyota vehicle was barely moving, but it still managed to collide with a visually impaired athlete on a crossing at the Paralympic Games, raising potential concerns about the limitations of autonomous driving technology. Toyota apologised in a video on YouTube after one of the company's self-driving vehicles hit the athlete while driving at 1 to 2 kilometers per hour around the Olympic Tokyo Village. Toyota has been providing a specifically designed version of its battery-powered automated e-pallet vehicles to transport athletes and staff during the Tokyo Olympics and Paralympic Games, which began earlier this week. It also said that the automated vehicles were designed to move at low speeds to increase safety, but that didn't help Japanese Paralympic judo athlete Aramitsu Kitazono. He was crossing a marked crosswalk in the athlete's village when an e-pallet made a right turn and struck him at a very low speed. At the time, the vehicle was under manual control of an operator who told police they were aware a person was there but thought the person would realise that the bus was coming and stop crossing the street. The athlete hurt his head and legs and was treated inside the athlete's village. Kitazono's coach said he missed the men's judo match, which he was scheduled to compete in on Saturday. And that's the latest here on Sputnik News. I'm Jamie Lowe.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Help, I've got the animal lobby on my tail. Two things. First of all, it's not my question, all right? I wouldn't have asked it. It was our editor, Ron Mackay, who hates dogs and cats, who devised the question. But secondly, most of you are completely wrong in what you are saying. People are saying the dogs and cats were in the hold and the plane was full of people. The plane was empty of people. And the dogs and cats were not all in the hold. They were in the cabin. Lee Collins says it was a private charter flight. The animals were in the hold. Not true. Spare seats were offered to anyone needing them. Well, up to a point, Lord Copper, because, as Lee adds, it was only the US changing the rules at the last minute that meant the staff and many other Afghans couldn't board. You feel me? Don't say that it was a charter flight that could have taken lots of Afghans out. The Afghans weren't allowed on board. And the dogs and cats were not in the hold. They were in the cabin. Now, if you're a true believer in market forces, you may well be right when you say a private charter flight can do anything it likes. It's the business only of those that paid for the charter flight. Strictly speaking, according to the laws of Adam Smith, that is correct. But it is very difficult for many of us, including me, even though I wouldn't have gone down this road of this poll question. It's very difficult to accept that one of the very last flights out of Kabul didn't have any people on it, but had lots of dogs and cats. Paid for to the tune of £1 million a year, I understand, by animal lovers and well-wishers. Neither is Ron Mackay the only person angry about this. The Ministry of Defence in Britain is furious about it. The chief Pied Piper of the dogs and cats is on tape in the newspapers this morning, threatening the MOD, threatening the army and the top brass of the military, that he would destroy them if they did not facilitate this flight. I know a lot of you love your dogs and cats, and I'm the last man to come between you and your dog and cat. But some of us find it a little difficult to swallow. Whoop. Now, as I said earlier, the Colin Wallace story was one that I was very familiar with in the 1970s and in the 1980s. As the former Colin Wallace and his confreres played out a deeply destabilizing role against the Labour government of Harold Wilson, whom I knew well, and about whom I spoke of these matters in very great detail, and also in the role of the British state in committing very serious crimes, including murder, against Irish people in the 6 counties of the northeast of Ireland. Michael Oswald is an independent documentary filmmaker of note, has produced a film about Colin Wallace, the man who knew too much. Take a look at this.
Good evening.
Colin Wallace had fractured Mr. Lewis's skull with a karate-style blow after he was accused of having an affair with Mr. Lewis's wife. He hid his friend's body in the boot of his car and later dumped it in the River Arun.
He says he was the victim of an MI5 dirty tricks campaign.
Colin Wallace repeated his claim he was framed by MI5.
In Northern Ireland in the 1970s, Wallace claimed he was an intelligence officer. Wallace alleges he became involved in a black propaganda campaign by the security services.
He accused MI5 of running a dirty tricks campaign against politicians.
Are you apprehensive about how you will be portrayed in the film?
And you want an answer to that?
Colin Wallace has been dismissed by the authorities as a Walter Mitty character, a man whose allegations were fabrications.
Well, the man who knows not too much, but definitely enough about Colin Wallace and the circumstances in which he found himself is, of course, the great filmmaker, Michael Oswald, who joins me now. Michael, thanks for coming on the show. Kindly describe, more succinctly than I was able to do, who was Colin Wallace, what did he do, and what did they do to him?
Hi, George, and thank you very much for inviting me on the show. It's really a great pleasure.
Welcome.
Yeah, so Colin Wallace was a British military intelligence officer who was right at the heart of psychological operations and the spreading of fake news in Northern Ireland in the 1970s. And he ended up questioning the legality of one of the campaigns that he was involved in, specifically the one that you mentioned about the targeting of British mainland politicians. And as a result of that, sections of the intelligence apparatus, the UK intelligence apparatus, turned against him, and he ended up being made redundant, and he became a whistleblower. And after that, he ended up being accused of a murder, and he was convicted for manslaughter, and he got 10 years in prison. And when he came out of prison, the authorities were claiming that he had never worked in intelligence, that he was a Walter Mitty character, and so he had to start right from the bottom to try and clear his name. So that is kind of the background of the film. It's an absolutely incredible human story. And I think also Colin Wallace is really an incredible human being with an incredible amount of perseverance.
Perseverance, for sure. That doesn't mean he's not a Walter Mitty, though. How persuaded were you by the end that he was on the level?
Well, I was actually very much persuaded that he was on the level. Of course, in the beginning, when I first contacted him, I had only read this book by Paul Foote, which was called Who Framed Colin Wallace. So I didn't realize that he had actually been cleared of the manslaughter. But he has been cleared. And of course, I think that there are questions you can ask about, was he running his own kind of campaign to try and clear his name? And I'm sure he would have used his experience, that he accumulated when he was working in psyops to try and clear his name. But in general, I was very much convinced of his innocence and that he is a genuine person. I mean, what is your opinion?
No, as I say, I was at Private Eye for a long time. Paul Foote I knew well. I was entirely persuaded by Paul Foote's book on him, but I never met Wallace, and you have. So I was interested really in your take on that. Let's go back to the 1970s and about the things that I know through my connection, which was relatively deep. I used to regularly call on the late Mr. Wilson in his rather gloomy flat behind the cathedral in Westminster, and we talk about these times when it's now quite clear, there's no paranoia here, that the British security services, or sections of them, were trying to overthrow the elected Labour government led by Harold Wilson. And many of the things that happened in the 1970s, like the Swiss francs that mysteriously ended up in a bank account that he'd never opened, of Ted Short, the Deputy Prime Minister, Deputy Leader of the Labour Party at the time, like some of the other scandals that tried to suck and draw Harold Wilson down. I'm in no doubt whatsoever that these dirty tricks operations happened, and Colin Wallace was involved in them, wasn't he?
Yes, he was involved in them. I think in terms of the targeting of UK politicians, I go into that a little bit in the film, but not too much, because my understanding is that Colin Wallace was merely using some of this information in his briefs. So the army had a problem with politicians in Westminster for a number of reasons. One of them was, I think, the shoot to kill policy and things like that. So they weren't happy about, and the Wilson government was, I think, also talking to the IRA. So there's a couple of things that I think the army and the intelligence services thought, they're acting a kind of against what our policies is and how we think this situation should be resolved. Now, I don't go into that too much in the film because it's something that you can't really measure it. It's something that happened, but we can't measure what impact it really had. I think what is really interesting about the film is that it kind of shows you how you create a fake news campaign and how you spread that into the kind of media and into reality, that essentially you can take or invent stories from scratch that have, there's no piece of actual factual information there, and it can be accepted as fact after, it's published in the newspapers. And information policy, the department in the Ministry of Defence that Colin Wallace worked for were very good at that. And so I think the value of this film is it kind of shows us at a time when the world was simpler, when fake news was spread mainly through newspapers, how it worked. And of course, today, the world is much more complex. We have the internet, we have social networks, and sometimes, it's difficult to see, like, where is all this information coming from and how is it moving? And here we have an example of a person who was right at the center of creating these fake news campaigns in a kind of, and is basically telling us, how he did it.
Does the film go into the use of sexual blackmail in Northern Ireland to suborn, to influence, to potentially destroy, to blackmail Northern Irish political figures?
Yes, it's also mentioned. I mean, the film mentions the kind of, Clockwork Orange, the Wilson plot, and it also goes into Kincora. It goes into these kind of very dark areas, but I don't know if it really, if you could say, it sheds new light on those areas. I think the value of the film is really much more about, how fake news in general is created and is spread.
I've got a call from Hong Kong, if you'll stay on the line, because it's from someone who met Wallace. Chris in Hong Kong. Chris, welcome.
How are you, George? Always welcome to get on the show. Delighted that you have somebody talking about Colin Wallace. He actually gave or visited the University of Leicester in approximately what I would deem the summer term of 1990. There were about 15 students in attendance, and we had about 3 hours of his time. He actually took us through how he was set up, etc. To me, the guy was genuine, and he did come out with some heavy-sounding stuff for people my age, in any case, in 1990 to you, which consequently the history itself has backed up to say, yeah, he was correct.
Well, it all was a grim time, Michael, wasn't it? I mean, there was a full-scale war going on. It was called low-intensity warfare, but it was pretty high low-intensity going on, and the stakes were high. The British security services were pulling out all the stops. How damaged does it left Wallace?
I mean, that is a good question. The thing is about Colin Wallace is he has an incredible amount of composure. So for me, I was just so surprised, how he comes across, how credible he comes across. And he doesn't seem to me damaged, but he is very controlled, and he has an answer for everything. And so I don't think this is a question I can answer, because I think he's just too experienced about how he is able to present himself.
Perhaps he learned that as part of the tradecraft. What does he do now? I was amazed he's still alive, actually.
Yeah, he's still alive. He still lives in the same house where he was accused of having, killed Jonathan Lewis, same town. He's still working, or he was when I last spoke to him. I think he caught COVID, and I think he has had some health problems because of that. But we are kind of very much hoping that he will get better. And yeah. So.
Does he regret the nefarious role that he played in those dark days? Is he evangelical about that?
I mean, that is a very good question. And I think when you watch the film, you will realize that this is a very complex person. He's a very complex character. And there are certain things that I think he can't reconcile. I don't think he can really reconcile some of the things that he did and what the army did with, in a way, what he's saying now and what he, represents now. Yeah.
So how do people see the film, Michael?
Well, the film is currently on pay-per-view, but on the big date is the 29th of September, where I will be uploading the film for free to YouTube. So I'm asking everyone to, watch it after that and share it as wide as possible, because I really think this is a film and a story that needs to be seen as widely as possible.
Well, I've rented it. I'm going to watch it tonight. I think it was Vimeo. It was on. I'm very interested in the subject. Anyone that's interested in intelligence matters in Ireland, the role of Britain in Ireland, and anyone interested in the politics of Labour and the Labour movement in the 1970s will, I'm sure, find it fascinating, because Colin Wallace was involved deeply in all of that. Best of luck with it, Michael. Thanks for coming on the show. I appreciate it very much, and good luck with the film. Now, crikey, this is the week that Princess Diana died in a car crash in Paris in 1997. Which hotel had she just left? A, Hotel Ritz, B, George V, C, Shangri-La. Answers after the break.
Radio Sputnik.
Tom says after independence we could choose the government we want. Tom, could you not have called me and argued that nonsense? Couldn't you? What's wrong with you, man? You've had the vaccine. Go ahead.
When I came out, I went into a boxer stance and started doing a jig. And an old fella said, "Hey, have you just had that vaccine?" I said, "Aye." And he said to his wife, "Come on, love, you better get me one of them." He said, "And make me dance."
So you're full of life. And Ben says, could Scotland actually do better autonomously? Like I want California to secede. But I think we'd thrive if not burdened by the rest of the US. How very revealing of you, Ben. How utterly revealing of you. And Philip says, how any Labour or Tory supporter has the nerve to say the SNP are corrupt is beyond me. Why do you people not have the guts to call up instead of cowering behind one single name on social media?
There's a lot of people in Bradford who won't be taking this antivirus due to religious grounds.
Simon, what do you mean by religious grounds?
Religious grounds, I mean, many Muslims, for example, have issues with regards to this vaccine. Certain things.
Tell me what issues? What issues?
Well, for example, pork.
What does pork have to do with this vaccine?
You're kind of, again, you're clouding the issue here. There's the religious.
I'm not clouding the issue. You said pork.
Of course
you said pork.
No, but
Simon,
other things which
Simon, are you yourself a Muslim?
It doesn't matter whether I am or not.
It does, because you are purporting. No, it does.
It's justified for people to ask that.
Be quiet for a moment, please.
No, I won't. It's justified.
Well, you will, because I'll turn your volume down. This is dangerous, reckless, ignorant, and potentially fatal nonsense. Get out of my sight and don't come back.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
As if Princess Diana would have stayed in a hotel called Shangri-La. That's probably in Blackpool. The hotel that she had just left in Paris was, of course, the Hotel Ritz, which was owned at the time by well-known Blackpool hotelier Mohammed Al-Fayed. You can, the poll numbers. Was it right to fly out 168 dogs and cats from Afghanistan rather than people? A, yes, 36%. B, no, 64%. On YouTube, more or less the same. Yes, 32, no, 68. On Telegram, yes, 27, no, 73. Not so many dog and cat lovers on Telegram. Anyway, 2,430 people have voted. I think you can still vote until the hour is up. Simon is in London on Afghanistan. Let's hear from him. Go ahead, Simon.
How you doing, George? Okay?
Good, sir. Nice to hear from you.
Well, that's good, yeah. I came on your show last week, you probably know, and questioned you on what I believe to be the West's sudden abrupt withdrawal of Afghanistan. Yeah. And I told you there was more to it than meets the eye. Your response was, if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, swims like a duck, then it is probably a duck, with regards to the American sudden withdrawal. Yeah. However, I still genuinely believe that US and the UK have withdrawn so that there's more to it than meets the eye. Saudi Arabia can bring proxies into Afghanistan and effectively use it as a base to achieve their primary objective, which has always been Iran, probably even Syria. But it was very clear in 2011, and it was in WikiLeaks, whereby they used premeditated instability in Syria, got ISIS in, used the Arab Spring as the excuse, paid hundreds of millions, billions of pounds probably to these ISIS proxies, and created what was effectively hell in Afghanistan. Now, for the last 2 weeks, in Syria. Now, for the last 2 weeks or so, US and the UK have been trying to remove civilians from the country, or so we are told. The Guardian also reported there's empty flights moving out of Afghanistan. Some of them have very limited personnel. However, what struck me the most this morning was an article on the BBC website. Did you know, George, that there's 43 helicopters, MD helicopters, 33 C-2 planes, 33 Black Hawk helicopters, 32 M17s and 23 A29s, and top it all off, 3 Hercules aircraft that have been left behind that could easily have been used to help civilians get out of the country, but no, they've been left behind. And like I said, a Hercules aircraft, like a jumbo jet, basically you could easily use that to transport civilians out of the country. Now, the Taliban may not be trained to use these planes, but my own gut feeling is that Western-trained Arab proxies who will be taking over Afghanistan very soon will indeed be using these, either against Iran or, dare I say, ourselves, considering the fact that it's 20 years since the tragedy of 9/11 happened, why couldn't the UK or US remove these planes or blow them up somehow before leaving?
Why then would, very interesting thesis, Simon, I don't entirely discount it. It is one of many possible outcomes of all of this. But why would Russia and China now be quite well along the road to diplomatic recognition of the Taliban? China doubling down on its copper mining investment there. Iran apparently reconciled and accepting the security guarantees from the Taliban about their border with Afghanistan. Do you think they're just hoping for the best, or that they've been fooled, or could it be that I'm right and you're wrong?
It could be that I'm right and you're wrong. It could be you're right and I'm wrong. It could be vice versa. But what's interesting is that it could be a game of chess, It could be the fact that the America in check, and now they're trying to get a checkmate out of nowhere by effectively drawing these countries, Russia, China, and of course Iran, into the country, and then releasing these proxies. I
personally think that's over-complicating things. The United States has been utterly humiliated. Its international standing is currently in ruins, in flames, it's in smoke. The President of the United States is effectively destroyed, his presidency destroyed in less than a year since his victory, and so on. I personally think that's overcomplicating it. But I don't rule it out, Simon. It's one of many possible outcomes. We'll just have to keep our eye on the ball, and you and I can keep talking about it. Thanks very much for the call. If you want to get your point of view over, then call me now if you're in the United Kingdom. And remember, the phone calls are completely free. The number is 08081 965522. That's 08081 965522. If you're in the United States, it's equally entirely free. And the number is +1 844 944 3344. That's in the United States, +1 844 944 3344. And remember, you can email the show at onair@moats.tv. Let's hear from Julian in London on ISIS. Go ahead, Julian.
Hello, George. I want to talk to you about the new variant.
The new variant of ISIS.
Yeah.
Very good.
ISIS-K.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering how we know the name. And I was reminded of when a friend of mine said to me, in a rather philosophical conversation, if the dinosaurs existed before human beings, how do we know what they were called? And I think this name must have been attributed by maybe newspapers, because ISIS don't even call themselves ISIS. And you can't do the Islamic State
appreciate
in Syria.
your.
You're not in Syria.
I appreciate your skepticism. I share some of it. But ISIS Khorasan, if you Google it, it was referred to by US policymakers in relation to the American presence in Syria and the war against Syria. Khorasan is actually a place. In fact, the William Dalrymple, with a wonderful, wonderful piece on the site Unheard, just yesterday I read it, talks about Khorasan. Khorasan is the area that I described, Afghanistan as we now know it, though it wasn't in the 19th century known as Afghanistan at all, with Pakistan, which of course wasn't either in existence until 1948, and parts of the former Soviet Central Asian stands, as they refer to them now. That's Khorasan. So just like you've got Al-Qaeda in the Arabic Peninsula, AQIP, just like you've got ISIS in Africa, so you have ISIS Khorasan in the area. But they are very small, they are underpowered, and I'm wondering how they managed to get all the way to the front gate of the airport with one man with explosives on his chest, how he managed to get through all those checkpoints that led him to the site of the mass killing. Julian, thanks very much for that. Bill Karmetsky says, Galloway, I love it when they start that way. Galloway, for 20 years, you never told your audience what Afghanistan was about. Ever. Really? Why don't you call me, Bill? It's 08081 965522. Call me now, I dare you, you gutless coward. Phone me now. I dare you. Let's hear from Mike in South Carolina. Go ahead, Mike.
Hey, George, how you doing today?
Good, sir. Well,
good to talk to you again.
And you.
Let me ask you a quick question before I start here. Do you actually have any pets, dogs, cats, like that?
I don't.
Okay, I thought maybe you didn't, but here's the thing. Ask yourself this question: Who do you think those pets belong to?
I think there were strays. I think there were strays, actually.
No. They belong to the people that are being evacuated from there, and they want their pets, and I can understand that. And being a pet owner myself, I do understand.
So the people that had already flown out, these were their pets.
Or either that or they're flying the pets out before they actually fly it themselves. But I guarantee you the pets belong to the people that are leaving Afghanistan. But that's really neither here nor there. I'm just saying that as something to think about. Okay. But here's the other thing. I think it was Simon was talking about all the equipment that was left over there, planes and helicopters and all that. But he has to understand that America, in its wanting to leave Afghanistan, also spent billions and billions of dollars propping up the Afghan government and the forces to support that government when they left, which totally turned over as soon as the Americans started to withdraw. They just gave up their post and didn't fight at all. Which I can kind of understand that because we were the occupying force over there. And but all that equipment was probably left for them, to use, to hopefully prop up the puppet government that we installed.
Yeah, but I'll tell you what, Mike. When the Hollywood movies come to be made, and they're probably already in production now, some SEALs would have been landed who would have blown all those Black Hawks up.
Yeah, but if you were giving those forces this equipment, you wouldn't blow them up. You would leave them there for them to use.
But once it was clear that the game was up, a few special forces, the special forces could have made this whole discussion odious, couldn't they?
Oh yeah, they could do it with just a few drone strikes right now if they really wanted to. They could. That could be done.
Good point. They could blow all that equipment up now, as they blew up that family in Kabul today.
Exactly right. But I'm saying there's always more to this than meets the eye. But you have to look at it from the perspective of the Afghanis, like the Afghani you had on the show there that was working at the American University in Afghanistan. There, you remember him?
He was very good. I thought he was an excellent guest.
Oh yeah, he was very good. But here's the thing, George. When a company or a country is being unoccupied, as it were, you have people in that country who actually help the occupiers, and they're not going to be looked on, very well by the people of the country that were trying to remove the occupiers. So he has a choice to make. He can either stay there and try to reform the country, which is all they can do. They can try to change the country from within, which is what should have happened in the beginning, not us trying to change it externally. But he has that decision to make, that he can either stay there and try to change the country, or he can leave it and let whatever happens happen.
Good point. Thanks for that, Mike, in South Carolina. Now, the widow of Dr. David Kelly gave evidence to the Hutton inquiry in This Week in 2003. What did she say her husband had felt? A, angry, B, disillusioned, C, betrayed. Now, I've just made a film on Dr. David Kelly. You can buy it on Vimeo. You can get a signed DVD from my shop. I hope that we'll put the details up on the screen. It has been critically received in an absolutely fantastic way. I still have not had one single person say anything other than that the film is a stunning revelation of just exactly what the people who ruled us in 2003 were really like. So what did Mrs. Kelly say? That her husband had felt A, angry, B, disillusioned, C, betrayed. Answer after the break.
Radio Sputnik.
Downloads of the podcast, huge numbers are downloading this week's highlights in the UK and in the US, but also in countries like Japan, India, Denmark, Saudi Arabia. You probably get executed for that. Korea, Switzerland, the UAE, and Hong Kong in China. Thank you for all the great reviews you've been leaving on Apple Podcasts, and including this one. In British politics, Mr. Galloway stands as the last bastion of sense. Like a fine wine, he gets better with age. I have been a fan of his since 2002. I would recommend anyone to listen to him. The best podcast around. Thank you very much indeed. That was touching testimony. Thank you so much. If you do listen, give a 5-star review. Why don't you?
You are listening to the Mother of All Talk Shows podcast with George Galloway.
They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime.
I like beer. Yeah, we drank beer.
Whoever's in charge, and I want the record.
Let's talk about that. Discussing all the controversies and news across the disunited states of America. Tune in to Fault Lines every weekday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern, only on Radio Sputnik.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Well, Mrs. Kelly said that her husband had felt not angry, not disillusioned, but betrayed. I think you'll like the Killing Kelly film. We've got some screenings coming up. If someone can give me the details, I'll announce them in the course of the rest of the show. So, let's go to Theo in Maine. Theo, welcome to the show.
Mr. Galloway, how you doing?
Theo, are you there?
Hello? Hello, can you hear me?
Have I lost him?
Hello,
there you
Mr.
go.
Galloway, it is an honor. It is an honor to be on your show, Mr. Galloway.
Thank you so much, Theo.
Yes, I only have one brief point to make. To me, it is not a coincidence, but I couldn't help but notice that in America's Saigon moment, that our vice president is literally in Saigon. I hope you could comment on that.
Yeah, very interesting. And laying flowers at what she thought was the monument to John McCain, but was in fact a monument to honor those that had shot him down. Because John McCain was actually trying to bomb and murder a huge number of women factory workers on that very site, and was shot down by the workers' own anti-aircraft position. I don't know how successful her visit was. I don't know if the Vietnamese leadership is foolish enough to be drawn into the US's anti-China front, which I'm sure was the real purpose of her visit. Of course, all wars have to end sometime. I'm not arguing for enmity between Vietnam and the United States, although I'm not sure that Vietnam has quite exacted the price from the United States that could even remotely be sufficient, commensurate to the utter mass murder of millions of Vietnamese people. I'm not sure how the ordinary people felt about the vice president of the US being there. Last word to you, Theo.
Well, I really have no further points besides that. I just wanted to wish everyone well, and I really want to thank you for doing the show.
I have never been in Maine, but it's one of my ambitions to sail off the coast of it. Thank you very much indeed for the call. Sarkar is in Glasgow. Let's hear from him. Sarkar, welcome back.
Thank you so much, George, for taking my call. George, how are you keeping?
By the grace of God, I'm good, thanks.
Thank you so much, George. My question is with relations to the latest deal which has happened between SNP and the Greens. The left, I don't know whether they're the left or what you call them, they're cheering for that. They're happy that 4-year-old can choose their own genders in the school. But they are not happy, but they are not, getting raging at the fact that Scotland's schools have performed one of the worst. in Glasgow, near Nicola Sturgeon's constituency.
In her own constituency.
In her own constituency. Her school, that school has performed the worst, but people can choose their own
worst school in Scotland.
Absolutely. And people can choose their own genders. Now, what I don't understand, George, there used to be a time when the left, or the so-called left nowadays, used to cheer for people's proper wages, proper living conditions, proper job rights. Nowadays, the left are happy, not getting angry at the lack of progress in the schools, but the fact that people can choose their own genders.
Yeah, as long as they get the pronouns right, Sarkar.
Absolutely. Where are the Tony
that's the long
Where are
and
the
the
Barbara
short of it.
Castles, George? Now, what I want to ask you is, if these fruitcakes do get independence, they cannot even save a biscuit factory. What can the Scottish and Greens do when they cannot attract investment, cannot improve the basic rights and results of education? What future are they building on towards independence, George? I'm really sad. I don't know what to say.
Very, very powerful points you make, as always, Sarkar. The big issue is not independence. That's never going to happen. There will be no referendum on separatism until a generation has passed from the last one. And I hope you and I are both still here, Sarkar, to vote in it. The problem's not so-called independence. That's not going to happen. The problem is the endless infatuation with independence. Even though it's not going to happen, there'll be no further referendum until at least 25, maybe 30 years has elapsed from the last one. It's the fact that Scottish politics is completely paralysed on everything but the SNP Green front politics, which have indeed, as you say, utterly subverted and distorted, perverted, if you'll forgive the phrase, perverted, out of all recognition from what used to be working class socialist politics in Scotland, in which I grew up, and which is entirely unrecognisable now. Truthfully, the people that call themselves and are thought of as being the left are more interested in personal pronouns, in self-identification, in men that identify as women being allowed to go into ladies' toilets and girls' changing rooms and participate in girls' sports and all. That's what they think is socialism, is leftism now. That's why I say, if that's the left, count me out. I obviously ain't left. Thanks for the call. Let's go to New Orleans. Who wouldn't want to? Where Tarif is. Go ahead, Tarif.
Thank you, George, for taking my call.
Welcome.
First, I'd like to say free drilling science, hands off Haiti, and free Derninger. Okay, this is two points to make about one comment dealing with Sirhan, who might get paroled. I hope this man get paroled and go to Jordan where they can protect him and ask him questions like, who was the doctors that he used to visit before the incident took place when R.F. Kennedy was assassinated? Do he remember the hospitals, the staff? Do he remember what was done to him before and after what took place dealing with RFK assassination? You have this group on YouTube called Troop Stream Media. They did documentations on doctors and these evil scientists as they do experimentations on people's brains, on minds. They used to use LSDs and other drugs and electroshock therapy. They used to call it psychodriving. The name of the documentary is called The Minds of Men. And also they used to use recordings of giving people negative feedback to people 250,000 times in one section that was basically trying to reprogram their mind. The project was called Sub-Project 68. It was underneath the CIA. The doctor that led it name was Dr. Cameron. The name of the institute was the Ravens Craig, but they changed the name to the Allen Memorial Institute. I think people need to investigate this to find out what was actually done to these people and other people at other facilities, so we can trace this down and help these people and find out what went on. But the name of the group is called Truth Stream Media.
Okay, well, check
it out, everyone.
Tarif, it's a subject I'm extremely interested in. Bobby Kennedy was very important to me, and I think that his murder changed the course of events for the worse in the United States. I want Sirhan to be freed because I don't believe that he was the murderer of Bobby Kennedy. I believe that the state killed Bobby Kennedy, and I'd like to find out who within the state apparatus gave the orders. Thanks very much for the call. A legend is on the line, so clear the decks. It's Fagash Flo. Norma in Bristol.
Hello.
Norma, welcome.
Yeah. Hello. It's just a lighter point, really.
Yeah.
On Diana's vote, what hotel she was staying, one of the rooms was Shangri-La, and you sort of poo-pooed it and said, oh, it might be a black.
I probably shouldn't have. I knew as soon as I did it. I'm probably in trouble over that.
You are, because I think Shangri-La hotels are the best in the world. They saved my husband's life in Hong Kong in 1997. My son was aired over because he was ill, and he stayed free of charge. I mean, my husband had a stroke, and immediate ambulance they sent, and they saved his life. And they treated me like a little queen for 6 weeks before we had a medical escort to fly back. Wow. And I just want to say that I just sort of looked it up on Google, and it says it's idyllic utopia, and it's a Tibetan word.
Yeah, I mean,
so
I know what Shangri-La means, and we all
I'm
hope,
sorry. Well, I didn't know.
We all hope
know.
to reach it. I was just,
right.
I meant that I didn't think that's where Diana was staying in Paris. But you're quite right to correct me that the Shangri-La in Hong Kong was so important to you. And we're all therefore grateful to them for that. Thanks very much, Norma, as always, for your point of view earlier than normal. The phone numbers are 08081 965522, particularly that lunatic, Bill Karmetsky. If you're a man at all, pick up the phone. 08081 965522. If you're in the United States, +1 844 944 3344. In the last hour, we have the one and only Chris Hedges, a man who, in a sane United States, would be in the White House, but at least we're able to quiz him about what's happening or not in the White House. Now, the poll has closed. A remarkable total of 3,050 votes in. Only 36% of you think it was right to fly out 168 dogs and cats from Afghanistan rather than people. And 64% of you think it was wrong. Now, there's another poll just been launched. Do you think the US and UK governments should recognize the Taliban? A, yes. B, no. C, depends. Get voting on my Twitter feed, on my YouTube, and on my Telegram. Now, Killing Kelly screenings, Saturday the 11th of September in Leicester at the Secular Hall at 2:30 p.m. Now, students go free. So if you book with an academic email address, that is to say ending ac.uk, you get free tickets. So students go free to all of these meetings. That's Leicester, Secular Hall. And then Monday, 25th October in London, South London at 7 p.m. Monday, the 15th of November in Manchester at 7 p.m. The news with Jamie Lowe. is coming up after this very, very brief musical interlude.
Radio Sputnik News.
A US drone has reportedly hit multiple suicide bombers on the way to Kabul airport. It follows an earlier US airstrike in the capital. US officials told the AP news agency that the drone struck a vehicle containing multiple suicide bombers on their way to the airport. It's understood that the threat was eliminated, they said. Footage shared on Twitter appears to show the aftermath of the explosion that occurred earlier near the capital city airport. The video was posted by a freelance journalist. Around 1,000 civilians remained at Kabul airport today to be flown out of Afghanistan before the last US troops withdraw on Tuesday. The British ambassador to Afghanistan has arrived in the UK, with the last of the British soldiers to leave Kabul expected to touch down within hours. The final flight left on Saturday, bringing an end to the UK's 20-year military involvement in Afghanistan. Ambassador Sir Laurie Bristow, who had been processing those fleeing the country at the airport, was among those who landed at RAF Bryce Norton base in Oxfordshire on Sunday morning. The flight came via the United Arab Emirates, and further flights carrying military and civilian personnel are expected later. More than 15,000 people have been evacuated by the UK since August 14th. The number of new COVID cases reported in Scotland has hit another high record of 7,113. It comes as Health Secretary Humza Yousaf warned that the NHS was facing a perfect storm of pressure. The latest government figures show a total of 507 people are in hospital with COVID and 52 are in intensive care. People under 40 are being urged to get the COVID jab to help ease the increasing strain on the NHS. Around 2/3 of cases are in the under 40s group. GPs are having to make difficult choices about which patients to get blood tests because of the ongoing shortage of test tubes, doctors are warning. Vials used for blood tests are currently in short supply, and the NHS in England and Wales is temporarily stopping all non-urgent testing. Doctors say they are in a perilous situation and want more clarity about how long the shortage will last. The government says it's working flat out with the supplier. Becton Dickinson, the company which supplies the NHS, said it had seen record demand for its blood collection tubes in recent months, partly driven by the need for tests for COVID patients. It also said it was facing issues transporting the tubes, for example, challenges at the UK border because of the shortage. The NHS in England and Wales has told surgeries and hospitals to temporarily stop some blood testing, with patients told they will only be able to get tests if they are urgent. Tens of thousands of people are fleeing the US state of Louisiana as Hurricane Ida closes in from the Gulf of Mexico. Ida is now a Category 4 hurricane, one below the highest level with up to 150 mph sustained winds. It's expected to make landfall later today, bringing a life-threatening storm surge. It's likely to be stronger than Hurricane Katrina, which devastated much of New Orleans in 2005. Traffic jams clogged motorways as residents heeded orders to evacuate. The current 150 mph maximum sustained wind speed is only 6 mph short. No Category 5 has ever hit Louisiana. A Brazilian woman has been sentenced to 31 years in prison for planning the murder of her husband, the former Greek ambassador to Brazil. In 2016, 59-year-old Kyriakos Amaridis' charred remains were found in the boot of a burned-out car in Rio de Janeiro. His wife, Francois de Souza Oliveira, had been having an affair with a military police officer, Sergio Gomes. Gomes later confessed to killing the ambassador at the behest of his lover and has been jailed for 22 years. At the end of their 3-day trial, a judge described their crime as bestial. A Californian parole board has voted to grant prison release to the murderer of Democratic 1968 president candidate Robert F. Kennedy. Sirhan Sirhan served 53 years in jail for shooting the frontrunner after a speech in Los Angeles hotel, arguably altering the course of history. The vote establishing that he is not a public threat does not necessarily guarantee that he will walk free. The decision now falls to the Democrat governor of California, Gavin Newsom, who is currently in the throes of an election campaign. Brazil's president, Jair Bolsonaro, says he sees three possibilities for his future: re-election in 2022, death, or imprisonment. According to most opinion polls, the far-right leader is trailing behind former left-wing president Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva in the race for presidency. Bolsonaro later added that the first opinion is out of the question. No man on earth will threaten me, he said. The former military officer was nearly killed after being stabbed in the abdomen during the 2018 presidential campaign. Apple chief executive Tim Cook has celebrated 10 years on the job by collecting and selling off $750 million worth of stock. The transactions were revealed in a regulatory filing on Thursday, which showed that Cook had acquired and sold more than 5 million shares of the iPhone maker. And finally, a self-driving Toyota vehicle was barely moving, but it still managed to collide with a visually impaired athlete on a crossing at the Paralympic Games, raising potential concerns about the limitations of autonomous driving technology. Toyota apologised in a video on YouTube after one of the company's self-driving vehicles hit the athlete while driving at 1 to 2 kilometers per hour around the Olympic Tokyo Village. Toyota has been providing a specifically designed version of its battery-powered automated e-pallet vehicles to transport athletes and staff during the Tokyo Olympics and Paralympic Games, which began earlier this week. It also said that the automated vehicles were designed to move at low speeds to increase safety, but that didn't help Japanese Paralympic judo athlete Aramitsu Kitazono. He was crossing a marked crosswalk in the athletes' village when an e-pallet made a right turn and struck him at a very low speed. At the time, the vehicle was under manual control of an operator who told police they were aware a person was there but thought the person would realise that the bus was coming and stop crossing the street. The athlete hurt his head and legs and was treated inside the athlete's village. Kitazono's coach said he missed the men's judo match, which he was scheduled to compete in on Saturday. And that's the latest here on Sputnik News. I'm Jamie Lowe.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold. Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
The final hour of the mother of all talk shows largely belongs to you, although I do have a very blue chip guest indeed that I'll introduce in just a minute. But let me again launch the second of tonight's polls. Do you think the US and UK governments should recognize the Taliban? A, yes. B, no. C, depends. You can vote on the usual platforms. My own view is that we don't really have any alternative but to recognize the Taliban. They are the power in that territory. Any sensible foreign policy accepts that we have to deal with those that are in power. And moreover, recognition and indeed trade and aid are probably the only ways left to us to influence the course of events in Afghanistan. The alternative, which some on the right appear to favour, is to inflame another civil war in Afghanistan, to embolden the Panjshir Valley-based former Northern Alliance that in the past has fought the Taliban bravely and to some extent successfully, fought the Soviet Union bravely and obviously successfully, independent of the Taliban. You can, if you like, pour weapons and money and petrol on what would then be a very big fire indeed. But beware that those were precisely the conditions in which Al-Qaeda flourished in the chaos of the Afghanistan that existed at the turning point of this 21st century. So careful what you wish for. I've been telling you that for 40 years in relation to Afghanistan. Be careful what you wish for. I dare say there may even be some zealots who, if a fight were to develop between the Taliban and ISIS, Al-Qaeda, would, as they have done in other places, be ready to boost ISIS and Al-Qaeda. That would be extremely foolish indeed. That's my view. Let's hear the view of Chris Hedges, journalist, writer and activist, it says here. That's rather like saying Cristiano Ronaldo is a footballer. He's a very special footballer, and Chris Hedges, a very special journalist, writer and activist. And he joins us now. Chris, thank you for coming on board. Let's start with that first question, or the question on our poll that I've just launched there. Do you think the US and UK governments should recognize the Taliban? Yes, no, or depends?
No, without question. But of course, the United States has already shuttered diplomatic relations, but worse than that, it has frozen the reserves of the central bank, $9.5 billion. The IMF will no longer give access to its lenders' resources. And we have to remember that grants from the United States and other countries accounted for 75% of the Afghan budget. So as all of this assistance instantly evaporates, it will compound a very dire humanitarian crisis. The UN is already raising the alarm. 14 million Afghans, that's 1 in 3, who lack sufficient food. 2 million Afghan children who are malnourished. Close to 4 million people in Afghanistan have been displaced from their homes. A drought destroyed 40% of the nation's crops last year. Already seeing shortages of food and skyrocketing food prices. That severance, we were paying the salaries of the army and most of the civil servants. The health service will clearly collapse. And that's what they want. The empire, like a wounded beast, wants to orchestrate a humanitarian crisis of biblical proportions. And I think you can go back and look at what the United States, through the UN, did in Iraq. UNICEF estimates that 500,000 children died as a direct result of sanctions imposed on Iraq. And I fear that child deaths in Afghanistan, given the response of the United States, will soar above that horrifying figure. So it's not just that we should recognize the Taliban. I think you could actually make a pretty strong case that we should pay reparations. But we're just putting a noose around the necks of the most vulnerable and poorest Afghans, not something particularly new, looking at what we did during the 9 years when we spent anywhere from $9 to $20 billion visiting hell on earth to Afghanistan to drive out the Soviets.
There are many reasons why that US response is foolish, not to even go onto the terrain of morality, but foolish from the standpoint of American statecraft, because as sure as eggs is eggs, that will force the Taliban-controlled Afghanistan to move increasingly, perhaps wholly, into the economic, political and diplomatic orbit of the neighboring countries.
Yes, and it will also fuel, I mean, they have nothing to lose in that sense. I mean, you look at the U.S. policy towards Iran, the recalcitrance on the part of U.S. policymakers to work with Iran wiped out the reformist sector, there was one within the Iranian government, and bolstered the hardliners. The Taliban, I don't know the Taliban well, but it's a very fractious group. There are 4 major ethnicities, but a total of roughly 20 ethnicities in the country. This kind of policy will give credence to the hardliners. Yes, of course, it's very foolish, but I think you can go all the way back to 1979 when we decided to visit another Vietnam on the Soviet Union. The Soviet had intervened in Afghanistan to prop up a very weak Marxist government, but that was part of the plan. When you go back and look at Brzezinski, this was Zbigniew Brzezinski was Carter's national security advisor. This was part of the plan to lure the Soviet Union in. They funded the most radical Mujahideen groups, essentially obliterating the secular democratic Afghan opposition. I mean, we hear all this talk about human rights for women. Well, human rights for women under the old Afghan government in Kabul were quite good. And the fact, the horror that we have visited, 1 million Afghans were killed in that conflict with the Soviets, 90,000 Mujahideen fighters, 18,000 Afghan troops, and about 15,000 Soviet soldiers. But all of these deaths were in the calculus of the American empire worth it. And again, I would go back to Iraq and look at the kinds of statements that were made, particularly by, at the time, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Madeleine Albright, when asked on a show here, 60 Minutes, whether the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children caused by the sanctions was worth it, she answered yes. So there is a kind of self-destructive quality, the power to destroy, given the size and reach of the U.S. military, is an intoxicating drug that becomes its own justification. And I think we also have to acknowledge that the chaos that is sowed, the United States CIA is not virtually not an intelligence gathering community. It runs rogue paramilitary organizations around the globe, interrogating people at black sites and often torturing them, carries out targeted assassinations, and also orchestrated commando raids in Afghanistan that killed a large number of civilians and sent enraged villagers and family members into the arms of Afghan civilians. There's a self-perpetuating quality to empire, which is ultimately self-destructive. And as we speak, we see Saleh, who was Ashraf Ghani's vice president, holed up in the Panjshir Valley. He's declared himself the legitimate caretaker president. You have Afghan Massoud, Mohammed Atta-Noor, Abdul Rashid Dostum. They're all clamoring to be armed and supported. Indeed, Massoud wrote an op-ed piece in the Washington Post a couple of days ago that talked about how his fighters needed U.S. weapons and ammunition and supplies. So it's just this perpetual war that the United States has visited now on almost 4 decades on Afghanistan. And I don't see it ending, given the way the empire works and the fact that the entities, the intelligence agencies that carry out these kind of dark wars are beyond public scrutiny and beyond public view.
Now, Massoud, he's the son of the former leader of the former Northern Alliance. He's educated at Oxford and Sandhurst, which tells you quite a lot, I think. He's crying out for arms and diplomatic and the kind of media and so on support that the Mujahideen once had. Is he likely to get it? Does the United States have the stomach for, as it were, becoming the foster parent of another civil war in Afghanistan?
Yes, and that is the pattern that the United States operates under. I mean, go back and look at what happened after the 1979 overthrow of the Shah. They funded some, pretty nefarious resistance groups who were labeled internationally as terrorist groups. That is how they operate. Their goal now is to make the Taliban pay, and of course the people who really pay are the most vulnerable in Afghan society, and destabilize the country as much as possible to cripple it. I would be shocked if the CIA was not at this moment working out arms transfers and support with Massoud and Saleh and Noor and Dostum and everyone else.
Now, all of this, I know that American media and so on refuses to use the word defeat, but anyone with two brain cells to rub together knows that the Taliban won the war, the United States and its allies lost it. And it's a bitter defeat to swallow, no doubt. But how damaging has it been to President Biden? Followed now hard on the heels with the footage of him falling asleep, literally. Many thought, I thought, he'd perhaps passed away, he'd been bored to death by Bennett. But I see that that's now becoming a bigger story. Is this the end of Joe Biden, is what I'm saying?
I mean, of course, this was a bipartisan catastrophe. Remember, Barack Obama used to run around calling Afghanistan the good war. He oversaw a surge into Afghanistan of, I think, 30,000 troops. So it's been a bipartisan effort. There's no Chuck Schumer supported Trump's massive proposal, over $700 billion to in the Pentagon budget, and increased by 10%. So there's no daylight on the parties. But of course, you're right. The Republican Party has attempted to use this very humiliating and swift defeat as a way to hurt Biden. I think it's too early to tell whether that will be an effective political weapon. And we have the congressional midterms coming up. Biden has another, 3.5 years or something to. So I wouldn't go so far as to say that this is the end of Joe Biden. But I would say that this is another signpost to the end of the American empire.
And do you think that anyone else other than you in the United States sees that already, or are they seeing it but hiding it?
Well, all the people who see it, the critics of empire, Andrew Bacevich, Noam Chomsky, Danny Shorson, who graduated from West Point, served as a combat officer in Afghanistan and Iraq, Alfred McCoy. I mean, there are plenty of critics of empire, but you'll never watch them on MSNBC or any other major network where you just get Petraeus, and who was in charge of the military operations at one point in both Iraq and Afghanistan, that went on and later led the CIA. Leon Panetta also led the CIA. I mean, these are the only voices that you hear. The critics of empire have been completely washed out of the media. And so the very architects of the disaster are now justifying. Petraeus had this there was this fawning piece about Petraeus in the New Yorker magazine a couple years ago, and he's essentially blaming Biden for his own ineptitude. I find it a remarkable event that the media just won't. I mean, John Bolton, of all people, his voice is now saturated over the media landscape. These are the people that made the mess, and they're never not only not held to account, but they're lionized by the very media entities that, if they were doing their journalistic duty, would be scrutinizing the disaster that they organized and for many years led.
And what of the liberals that were so dewy-eyed at Joe Biden because he wasn't Donald Trump? The paroxysms of joy on CNN, MSNBC, and in the Washington Post and the Times and so on. How do they feel today?
Well, they've been largely defensive of Biden. The critique revolves around the way the United States withdrew. Could we have left 3,500, I think was the number of combat support troops behind? Biden is really handled quite gently by the quote-unquote liberal media. But let's remember that Biden, again, was one of the architects of these wars. In fact, especially with the invasion of Iraq, Biden, as a senator, played a very major role in organizing support and calling out for the war. So the Republicans, who are culpable as well, of course, the Republican Party started the war in Afghanistan under George W. Bush, they are using this like a bludgeon. But that's to be expected in among a clashing kind of political class, and their voices are being amplified throughout the media. But I would say the liberal media, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, those CNN, they have been since before the election extremely protective of Biden because he represents the return to the I would call the kind of gravitas of the empire that Donald Trump so consistently exploded through his ineptitude and vulgarisms. And it's not that they were particularly against what Trump did. Trump served the empire and Wall Street as assiduously as anyone else. It was more the presentation to the rest of the world, and that's why they got Biden, who is kind of, as you pointed out, in and out. We don't really know how much he's there or how much he isn't there, but he's a good figurehead for the empire.
But these empire loyalists, they must know in their heart that they've just received one hell of a beating from ragged-assed men on bicycles with Kalashnikovs. It must be very difficult for them to deny that, at least to themselves.
I don't know. If you turned on American television channels, the principal theme is that we did not lose to the Taliban. We beat ourselves. You have former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster calling it self-defeat. Eugene Robinson, who's a columnist for the Washington Post, is calling it a war we did not win. So I watched this at the end of the Vietnam War. I was a kid, but it was the same rhetoric. You never heard the word defeat, and you're not hearing that now.
There'll be a whole generation of Hollywood movies.
Right.
Already, they'll be receiving the scripts right now, and it'll be how dreadful it was that the Afghans made the Americans do all this to themselves. Chris Hedges, thank you very much indeed for another masterful tour of the political horizon. Many thanks for joining us. Let's hear from Roger in Leicester. Roger, go ahead.
Hello, George. It's lovely to speak to you again.
And you, sir?
Thank you very much. What I want to say really is I think what has happened in Afghanistan now, the dust has settled, has been totally and utterly predictable. Because the people who are now in charge of America, they're basically white they're anti-white, they're anti-democratic, they want to defund the police, they want to dismantle America. And what better opportunity did they have? It landed on their laps. I don't think we can blame Joe Biden. He's a shell. He doesn't know his true mind, not really. And he's at the hands of advisors who are advising him on everything to say and everything to do. And he's been their puppet. And this is done by people within America who hate America. We know that. That's blatant by what they've been telling us for years. But for some reason, the good people of America somehow have voted them in.
Controversial stuff,
that's the
Roger.
point
We'll see if there's any
I wanna
Americans got a point of view on that. Can I squeeze in John from Dorset? Let's hear from him. John in Dorset, go ahead.
Oh, hello, George. Just
Hi.
to change the subject slightly,
Okay.
I'm not really so topical now because it was a couple of weeks when I raised this subject, but I hope it's still relevant.
Okay.
It was just something I saw on the dreadful old YouTube. I know that we shouldn't look at it, but it hypnotises me, unfortunately, George.
Okay.
Now, I saw something that was quite alarming in Speaker's Corner, and there was a kerfuffle going on, and a young lady got stabbed in the face.
I saw that,
Now, yeah. Well, I think that's horrifying enough. But
Did they catch the fanatic that did that?
Now then, that is the point what I was ringing about, to be honest. I don't think they even tried, to be quite honest.
Well, I saw the police car chasing him in the park. I was a bit surprised that he seemed to get away because I never saw a report of an arrest.
No, nor did I. And that is another thing that is, happens quite a lot these days, is that it goes quiet. When you want to know the resolution of something you might see on, nothing happens, or if it is, it comes up 6 months later and the bloke gets, cup of tea and told not to do it again. But I do find that our cops soft pedal when they want to, and there are times when I do think they overreact on incidents.
Well, I must say,
Do you agree?
as someone who has been on, 500 demonstrations in London, I was a bit surprised how Extinction Rebellion were able to deface and vandalise the statue right outside the gates of Buckingham Palace. As a matter of fact, I'm surprised they got anywhere near the gates of Buckingham Palace. If it had been a demonstration of coal miners, I feel pretty sure that we would not have got that close. John, thanks for that interesting call. Now, this was the week in 1939 that Britain and France declared war on Germany. What caused it? A, the invasion of Poland. B, the invasion of Hungary. C, the invasion of Czechoslovakia. Answers right after this short break. If you're in the United Kingdom, it's 0808196 5522. If you're in the United States, it's +1 844 944 3344. Let me hear from you.
I was just listening to your previous callers about the manufacturing of consent.
Yeah.
People are powerless. They're drowning in a cocktail of confusion, and they just don't know what to do, and they know no one's speaking up for them.
It's bristling out there amongst the white English working class. They feel that Labour hates them, and they hate Labour back.
I think the idea of this capitalism thing that we have limited respect for, which is linked with freedom compared to like a strict socialist, people going on to welfare and not being able to work. And I feel like that almost the world, this great reset and build back better and all these key words that come out with country leaders all over the world, it seems to me to be a little bit worrying.
Now, you shouldn't be any more worried than you were before, but you shouldn't be any less worried than you were before either.
If you're a lawyer, which unfortunately, what's his name? Keir Starmer is, he's spending all of his time being right about everything. You know, he can't appeal to every community. It's not good enough. It really isn't good enough. You know, there were 4 other candidates and they were all better than him.
Why has the Labour Party failed so miserably? I mean...
Well, the Labour Party has fallen out of love with the British people, and the British people have reciprocated.
Yeah, but don't you think Labour had some part to play in that, though, with the whole classism thing? I mean, like, you're supposed to be old Labour, like you went against new Labour, inverted commas. So don't you think it's on people like you to promote actual Labour policies or whatever?
Why should I? What do I owe the Labour Party, Dan?
Labour Party or whatever.
I think the Labour Party is a catastrophic disaster.
Do something about it then. Why are you complaining about it? Why don't you do something about it, right? Instead of complaining.
But Dan obviously doesn't know that I'm actually the leader of a rival political party and stand against the Labour Party in elections.
And George, do you know something else?
You're not going to sing again, are you?
For the last time you spoke to me, you ain't nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time. Well, you ain't never caught a rabbit. You ain't no friend of mine.
You've actually got a great voice.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
The answer, of course, was the invasion of Poland. This week in 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany following the invasion of Poland. Do you think the US and UK governments should recognize the Taliban? A, yes, 34%. No, a surprising 50%. C, depends, 16%. Well, I hope people have let us know what it would depend on and what their alternative is to not recognizing the people who are actually in power in Kabul. It's a novel idea. Don't forget, as I said, I'll be speaking in Leicester on the 11th of September at the Secular Hall, 2:30 p.m., and showing the Killing Kelly film about the strange death of Dr. David Kelly. You can get your tickets, www.ticketsource.co.uk/Killing Kelly. And students go free as long as their email has ac.uk at the end of it. There it is on the screen now. I'm speaking in London on the 25th of October at 7 p.m. That's a Monday night. And I'm speaking in Manchester on the 15th of November, again, a Monday night at 7 p.m. And you can get the tickets for those events from that address. Let's hear from Jonathan in South Africa. Go ahead, Jonathan.
George, thank you very much.
Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Just on the question of the dogs versus the people, I don't see why both could have been evacuated if this had been properly planned. So, you know, the civilians and their dogs should have been actually taken out, but it was such a haphazard and catastrophic, withdrawal strategically out of Afghanistan that beggars belief. Secondly, I wanted to ask you, the decline of the empire is a consistent theme. So I'm actually seeing that you are talking about the decline of the Western Empire and specifically the American Empire.
Yep.
And after 20 years and over $2 trillion in Afghanistan, with nothing to see other than a Taliban government and a catastrophe that's happening at the moment, where does this leave the UK? And we are talking about a Western decline. We're talking about an empire that is in decline. And we've seen it in the Roman Empire. We are now seeing it in the Western Empire. And we are letting in people, immigrants, etc. This is must be a win for the Chinese, Iranian, and Russian triumvirate.
It is an epochal moment, I think. It is an historic turning point. It is the not the beginning of the end, for that beginning had already begun. It is a rapid accelerant of the decline of what you call the Western Empire, I call the American Empire. What it means for Britain, who over the last many decades now have been going around the world threatening people with America's army, much in the way that Mussolini used to do with Hitler's army. It's a big, big opportunity for us now to design a dignified way and role for ourselves in the world. A tale is uncomfortably close to you know where. It's not a dignified thing to be a tale. And to be the tale of an American dog that is led by one imbecile after another with the punctuation of the Professor Barack Obama, who was, if anything, even worse than the imbeciles, it's particularly undignified. So I want Britain to strike out on our own in the world as an independent country, a country with ethics, with morals, with a culture and a language that is loved and understood in the world, and with the political role commensurate with a big cultural power like us. We are a big cultural power. Our game, football, our music, our literature, and so on, are all immensely powerful for a small island with a middle-sized population. I want to capitalize on those assets, Jonathan. I want to make a new Britain, a new Jerusalem in this green and pleasant land. Thanks very much for the call. Let's go to Ian in Hounslow in London. Go ahead, Ian.
Hello, George.
Hi.
I was prompted by Sarker's very profound call from Glasgow about the liberal elite masquerading as the left. And it made my blood boil, quite frankly. And I want to make something similar. The Plymouth shooting, 5 dead. An LBC presenter wanted to blame this on an incel, misogyny, Western white male right-wing terrorism culture, when in fact I put it to her, how can it be easier to get access to firearms than to emergency mental health care, what his mother had been begging for weeks? And she shouted at me and slammed the phone down, because her narrative was white men are a threat to all of us. Now, 40% of Metropolitan Police time is tied up with mental health emergencies because of Thatcher's destruction of the mental health service in the 80s and the failure of the care and the community programme. That's what we should be asking for. And she didn't want to know. She did not want to know. Now, to exploit a tragedy like this for your own political narratives is quite frankly depraved. That's my opinion.
Well, you've made it very clear and very powerfully. And that's another story that has gone remarkably quiet. And I'm not sure why, or perhaps I am sure why. The killer's mother was begging for help for her increasingly unhinged son. She begged the authorities to take his gun off him, although the authorities gave him back his gun license. And these innocent people now lie in the earth and would otherwise have still been with us if that gun had been taken off a man that was going mad, whose own family were desperately seeking mental health treatment for him, and yet they gave him a pump action shotgun license. Please. Mark is in North Carolina. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, how's it going, George?
Good. Nice to hear from you.
Yeah, good. Yeah, good to hear you again too. Listen, I was just listening to what you're saying about Vietnam before and Kamala Harris. George, we're in such trouble here in this country. We've got this demented fool of a what I call an imposter, because I don't really think he's president, that sits in the White House. Okay, and this is his backup. All right, who's probably going to somewhere along the line is probably going to become so-called president. And this idiot thinks that John McCain is being celebrated
in Vietnam.
Monument is John McCain.
With a monument.
That's
a monument to him.
Yeah, with a monument, exactly. That's like if she went to England and saw a monument there and thought it was a monument to Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe in World War II.
It is. You got to laugh. You got to laugh or cry, Mark. I'm not sure which.
Both. But I'll tell you this, George. I am glad about one thing. This empire, I believe, is coming to a close. I consider basically all empires evil. It's the evil empire. And hopefully we're going to bring back our constitutional republic, and we're going to become a better country for it. Okay? Just like I believe Russia has become a better country after getting rid of their empire. All right? They had to go through some rough times, especially in the 1990s, but they're back in the saddle now. They're a great nation, and they're not doing some of the stupid stuff that we're doing, and they're interested in empire. And I just hope that's going to be the case for the United States. And I hope for your country, too. Okay?
I hope that very much, both for my country and for yours, Mark. Great call from North Carolina. Robert is in London. Go ahead, Robert.
Yes, Gigi.
Go ahead, sir.
Galloway.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for taking my call. What happened is, what I want to talk about is, the children which is not, reach the poverty. Yeah, and they're talking about gender,
reassigning their gender path. Yeah.
Yeah, but this is unheard of. Why is these laws are coming to this country? First they put Obama, from President Obama to Africa, to bring this lesbianism and gayism in African society. The whole Africa now, gay is everywhere. That if we don't allow these things to happen in your country, yeah, we will not give you aid, we will not give you this, we will not give you that. So now it's a problem in our societies now. Now they're bringing it all over here now, that a child that has not reached age of decision, that he can choose his own gender. I mean, even in the scripture.
You think you've got it bad in London? Try living in Scotland, where the new regulations are that at the age of 4, a child may ask the teacher secretly, without the knowledge of the parents, to treat them as a boy rather than a girl, or a girl rather than a boy. Let them change their name. Let them change their pronoun. Let them change which toilet they go into, which changing room they use. Just until 4 o'clock, mind. And then they go back to their unsuspecting parents in their own home, only to go through it all again the next day from the age of 4. This society that we live in is seriously off the right path, off the correct path. Believe me, we are headed for serious trouble in our country. Let's hear from William in Carnoustie, quite near my old stamping grounds. William, welcome.
Hey, George, how you doing?
Good, nice to hear from you. What would you like to say?
Okay, well, look, it's actually just an observation that I've got. You know, I used to live in Scotland. I'm based in Germany, and I come back here fairly frequently, you know. And I used to live in the central belt between Glasgow and Edinburgh. And I'm telling you, every time I come back, it gets worse and worse. There's people queuing outside food banks, and really, you know, I get this. Like,
will the drug death capital of the world, will the COVID capital of Britain, which is the COVID capital of Europe, I could go on, William.
Well, look, to be honest, you know, I'm from there, and I've got a lot of good friends that live there as well, and because they're, like, living in the Matrix 24/7, you know, they don't see it. But when I come back, I'm just like that, holy shit, this place is really going to the dogs, you know?
And to what do you attribute this, William?
Well, where do we start? It's like these people in the square mile of London, you know? Anybody outside London, they're not interested. It's like Scotland's, what do we call it? An annexed state, you know, just like wage slaves.
You're having a laugh. You're blaming the City of London for Scotland having the worst drugs deaths in the world, when it is entirely devolved to a Scottish government that has been controlled for 14 years by the SNP. You want to blame the City of London for that?
Oh, well, look, what I'll say is, you know, the Scottish government's just a farce. It's a paper government. It's like, okay, we'll let you park for free in the hospitals, you know. We're looking after you. These guys are controlled by Parliament in London. Come on, we both know that.
They're not controlled by Parliament in London. I wish they were. Things were better when they were. There's no getting away from this, William. The SNP have been in government for 14 years, during which time our schools went to rack and ruin. Our health service became one of the worst in Western Europe and one of the worst performing COVID authorities in Europe. We've gone from nowhere to becoming the drugs death capital, not of Europe, but of the world. We can't build ferries. We can't organize exams for our kids. We've handed out £100 million to Rangers directors for falsely prosecuting them. The country is falling to pieces, and it's all attributable to the paper government, as you call it, in Edinburgh. Let's go to Sean in Stevenage. Go ahead, Sean.
Hey up, George. How you doing?
Good. My blood's boiling, but never mind.
Well, let's see if I can blow your hat off the top of your head then. I'm responding really to Mike from the US when he was talking about, I know it's the dogs and cats again, but these dogs and cats, they're not pets, they're rescue animals. It's a charity set up by former
rescue
Royal
cat.
Marine.
I've never heard of that one, Sean.
Rescue cats and dogs. They're rescued. They don't do rescues, but they're rescued.
I beg your pardon. Sorry.
Yeah, he set up the charity. They're to be companion animals for ex-military that are suffering from PTSD.
But have we not got enough stray cats in our own country?
We probably have, but he happened to be serving in Afghanistan. He set the charity up. He decided he wanted to try and help the animals. He decided he wanted to try and help his former colleagues. There's a few misconceptions about the flight as well. They were in the hold. The flight called in at another European country where some animals were transferred to the cabin where there's a vet on board, and the vet is in a report saying they checked a few of them over while they were in the cabin. But the point being, I think the MOD has got the ump here, because he's shown them up to be a man of loyalty and integrity to his charges, those under his care, which are the weakest in any society, are the animals. They don't have to be there. He tried to get his staff out. They kept changing the bureaucracy, so he couldn't get them out, the staff and the families. Now, you may argue perhaps they could have put other people on that flight with the animals in the hold. Okay, but who knows what went on at the airport? They probably told him just to get off the ground. The point being, he cares about his former comrades. The MOD didn't give a flying fig for a lot of soldiers who came back with PTSD and as amputees. And don't forget, a few years back, they had to be shamed into setting up a rehabilitation place in Birmingham to deal with amputees. And they still don't care about the soldiers that have been out there over the 20 years. So for Tugendhat and Wallace to be furious about this Marine who's got one over them, I ain't got no sympathy for him. He's made them look like idiots.
Very powerful call, Sean. Call of the night. Absolutely powerful.
You, George.
Let's go to David in London. Something's going on here. What is it? Go ahead.
Hello?
Go ahead, David.
Hi, can you hear me, George?
I can hear you clearly, yes.
It's a pleasure to talk to you. I'm a first-time caller.
Okay.
So please, I'm just a bit confused why people seem to be so happy about the end of the so-called American empire compared to what the possibilities are that what could follow it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, well, I don't want it to be followed by any empire, David. I don't believe in empire. I want it to be followed by equilibrium in the world.
Okay, fair
which
point.
Which requires a sharing of power, which requires many points to keep the world stable and balanced. I mean, just because we're celebrating, as I can assure you am, the ending of the American empire, does not so that I can get a different empire in power. I don't want any empire in power.
No, and I respect your point of view. It's just they have done some good points.
Give me your best 2 points that the American empire have given us.
Stability during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We averted the thermonuclear war.
But there wouldn't have been a Cuban Missile Crisis if it hadn't been for American invasion of Cuba.
Okay.
At the Bay of Pigs. Anyway, give me your second best one.
I can't come up with
anything. Don't worry, David. You're a first-time caller.
No,
come back again. Come back again with another call, because for some mysterious reason, my good wife is advancing upon me with something in her hands. I know not what's happening.
Well, it was kind of a surprise for us as well, but I'd like to present to you a gift from one of your Moats listeners, a very special gift.
Oh, wow.
Which is...
Bob Dylan.
Bob Dylan, indeed. And an official
signed... very beautiful picture of Bob.
Picture of Bob with its certificate of authenticity.
Wow. How wonderful is this?
Yes.
And is this what, for my birthday?
No.
My
this
Christmas.
was a present from a Moats listener for Christmas, but due to a logistical error...
It's only just arrived.
It's only just arrived. So our apologies for not acknowledging this
It's
before.
from Santa, but in Edinburgh.
Yes.
I'll not read out your telephone number, Santa, because all the children will be right on to you. It's all very, very nice,
yes.
I must say.
Very.
So that's the painting, which is an oil painting. Very, very nice. These are all the themes of Bob Dylan's work, the greatest writer since Shakespeare. And I must say, this is a stunning
beautiful
photograph of Bob. Really, really stunning. 80 years forever young. It's signed, is it signed by Bob? Yes. My goodness. And a certificate of that authenticity. That is Santa. That is the nicest present I got last Christmas. And I'm really glad it caught up with us. Look, we're running rapidly out of time. Thank you very kindly, whoever you are in Edinburgh. It's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you. And if it was, then come back next week at the same time. This show was dedicated to the late and great Brian Travers, but for copyright reasons, I'd now be playing you out with one of his masterpieces. All I can do is ask you in what remains of the evening to just play some UB40 and listen to that saxophone, man. May God bless you, Brian. I hope I'll see you one day again.